Chapter 10 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Barbara Purcell stood alone by the window, her eyes fixed upon the torches that were spitting and flaring in the rain. The salon had been emptied of its wits and gallants, and though the men had been whirled away into the darkness by the very energy of my Lord Pembroke's wrath, the women were left alone with the cynical old aristocrat who dabbled in science, and who had not moved from his chair during the brawl. Hortense, who had dreaded bloodshed in her house, and the scandal that might follow, was watching from another window, with the three girls and the widow gathered round her. My Lady Purcell appeared to be the most vexed and troubled of them all. She moved restlessly about the room, sat down in a chair beside the cynic, spoke a few words to him, and seemed repelled by the flippancy of his retort, rose again, walked to and fro for a minute, and then, as though driven thither by some spasm of suspense, joined Hortense and the rest at the window. The Mancini heard my lady's deep breathing, and, turning to make room for her, was startled by the scared expression of her face; but, being discreet, she ignored her guest's uneasiness. "These men, they must be for ever quarrelling. As for that mad, irresponsible lord, I am always in dread of murder when he enters my house." Anne Purcell leaned against the window jamb. "And they must drag in others, too. I suppose Howard and Stephen Gore will be at each other's throats." Hortense eyed her curiously. "I think they have too much wisdom to cross swords over a lunatic. Who is the little brown man, with broad shoulders and the cool face?" "John Gore, my lord's son." "Jack Gore, a good name for a gallant swashbuckler. The fellow pleased me. He has a backbone and a keen eye. It was like a scene out of a stage play. And there is the distressed damsel, your daughter, watching to see her champion do his devoir." Anne Purcell glanced at Barbara and gave a shrug of the shoulders. If the fool had only some sense! If, yes, if. The stubborn brat, to shut her eyes to a mere piece of play. Hortense looked thoughtful. "Pardon me, but the girl is no fool. That is my belief. It was no sulky, stupid child that dared my Lord Pembroke to bully her." "No?" "No, but a woman with pride, and a depth of courage in her that could make her dangerous in a quarrel. My Lady Purcell, I could swear that your daughter is cleverer than you imagine." Hortense saw the plump woman's face harden. "Perhaps," she retorted brusquely. "For myself, I have always thought her a little mad." As for Barbara, she had no memory for Hortense and the rest. The dim, rain-smirched park, with its pool of stormy light, absorbed all the life in her for the moment. She had seen the torches go tossing out from the gate, with a trail of shadowy figures following. The link boys had headed for the great tree where there would be some shelter from the rain. The torches made a wavering yellow circle about the four chief figures, and the rest of the gentlemen gathered in the deeper shadows under the tree. The drifting rain blurred and distorted the details as bad glass distorts the landscape to one at watch behind a window. Yet the four figures with the smoke and flare of the torches seemed vividly distinct to her. Two of them stripped of cloaks and coats, so that their white shirts showed up like patches of snow on a distant mountain-side. Engrossed as she was, she heard one of the watchers at the other window give a sharp cry of relief. "At last! See, they have begun. My Lord Gore and Howard stand aside." It was her mother's voice, and the words seemed to set some subtle surmise moving in the daughter's brain. She remained motionless, her eyes on the circle of torches and the faint flicker of steel that was discernible as the two swords crossed. She heard a short, dry laugh, and turned to find the Fellow of the Royal Society standing at her elbow. He was watching the scene under the tree with eyes that had lost none of their youthful sharpness. "There is no need for anxiety," he said, with a friendly glance at Barbara. They stood side by side in silence for a minute. Then the cynic nodded in the direction of the park. That mad jackass stood no chance against Stephen Gore's son. Just as I thought. That will keep the fool quiet for a time at least." There was a sudden swaying of the torches, and the circle of figures swept in upon my Lord Pembroke and John Gore as the sea sweeps in on a sinking ship. Nothing was discernible for the moment but the torch flare and the knot of eager, crowding men. Then the circle parted abruptly, and they could see two friends throwing his coat and cloak over my Lord Pembroke's shoulders. He was leaning against his second, his sword-arm hanging at his side. The torches swayed forward and moved in a blot of light from under the tree. John Gore, with his sword set in the grass, was struggling into his coat, his eyes watching the violent fool whom he had wounded in the shoulder. Stephen Gore, distinguishable by his stateliness and his bulk, threw a cloak over his son's shoulders. The torches moved away, the figures scattered, and the whole scene seemed to melt into nothingness behind the falling rain. The cynic and Miss Barbara still maintained their silent fellowship at the window, as though they approached to each other by showing an uncompromising front toward the world. Her companion seemed to hint that they had a common interest in the proceedings, when he pointed out to her that a couple of torches were moving back toward the house. "Here come the gentlemen who will assure us. Had I had the guiding of that young man's sword, I should have pricked that wind-bag for good and all." He continued to talk, as though addressing no one in particular, but only enumerating his own thoughts. "But then, of course, it would be deucedly inconvenient. It is much wiser to let fashionable fools alone. If you kill them, there will be trouble. If you wing them only, there will still be trouble. It is probable that we shall hear within a month or so that my Lord Gore's son has been bludgeoned some dark night." Barbara glanced at him with a sharp challenge in her eyes. "Pardon me, it is a very usual method of procedure among gentlemen of fashion. If you have an enemy who is too strong for you, or a man you are afraid to fight, you hire a couple of bullies to ambuscade him and crack his skull. Both your honour and your spite are thereby greatly relieved." The torches were close to the gate of the courtyard, though the watchers at the window could but dimly distinguish the faces of those who were returning. "I hope to heaven he is not hurt." "Stay there, children. You must not meddle in these men's affairs." Hortense and my Lady Anne had moved by mutual impulse toward the door. The girls, who had wished to follow them, remained talking in undertones near the harpsichord, but Barbara was bound by no such casual regulations. She left the cynic by the window, and followed her mother and Hortense. From the salon the staircase of the great house ran with broad shallow steps into the hall. The beautiful balustrade was of carved oak, the corner pillars topped with griffins holding gilded shields. French tapestries covered the walls, and from the central boss of the ceiling a great brass lantern hung by a chain. Hortense paused at the stairs' head, with Anne Purcell at her side. The rain rattled against the windows, with the light of the torches casting wavering shadows over the glass. A servant stood holding the door of the hall open, with the torches making a turmoil of smoke and flame. Barbara, as she came from the salon, was struck by the eager poise of her mother's figure as she leaned forward slightly over the balustrade. My Lord Gore and his son came in out of the night, with their cloaks a-glisten, the rain dropping from their beavers. The vision that greeted them was the vision of two women waiting at the stairs' head in their rich dresses, the light from the lantern throwing their figures into high relief. Hortense, in autumn gold, tall and opulent, crowned by her crown of splendid hair, seemed a figure divine enough to top that great oak stairway with its sweep of shadows. Anne Purcell, leaning forward with one hand on a carved pillar, symbolized watchfulness and secret suspense, while in the background the Spanish swarthiness of her daughter's face added that mystery and solemn strangeness to the picture that life conveys in its moment of pathos or of passion. My Lord Gore made straight for the stairway, hat in hand. "Soyez tranquille, mesdames, a mere pin-prick in the shoulder." Hortense glanced past him with interest at the bronzed and imperturbable face of his son. "Whose was the wound? Not—" "No, no. My jackanape had the madman at his mercy. May we men of blood ascend? Assuredly the name of Gore seems suited to the occasion." He turned his head and smiled over his shoulder at his son. "Come up, my Jack the Giant Killer. Where is our little mistress, our inspirer of heroics?" Anne Purcell bent toward him, as though swayed by her woman's instinct. "The little fool shall stay at home in future. Psst! Beware!" My lord gave a forced laugh and looked upward over my lady's shoulder. He had caught sight of Barbara standing in the doorway of the salon. "Behold the inflamer of the peaceful citizens of Westminster. Mistress Barbara, my child, see what an obstinate mouth will do." Anne Purcell and Hortense had both turned toward the salon. My Lord Stephen was at the stairs' head, his son a little below him, with the light from the lantern falling full upon his face. But the girl standing in the doorway of the salon seemed the significant and compelling figure of the moment. She was staring at John Gore with a bleak intentness that ignored the three who waited for her to make way. "Barbara!" Her mother seized her arm and pushed her, almost roughly, into the salon. "Where are your wits, girl? Don't gape like that. On my honor, I think you are mad." She suffered her mother's hectoring with an apathy that betrayed neither resentment nor understanding. Her eyes held John Gore's for the moment. Then she turned and walked back to the window as though she had no more interest in the affair. Yet she had seen on the cloak that John Gore was wearing 3 short chains of gold, each with a knot of pearls for a button. They were spaced out irregularly, those 3 strands of gold, as though one had been lost, perhaps torn off in a struggle and never been replaced. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. My lord paused abruptly with the wine decanter in his hand, his eyes fixed in a vacant stare on his son, who was drawing a high-backed chair forward to the table. The rumble of the wheels of the coach that had brought them home from Hortense Mancini's could be heard dying away along St. James's. "Wine, Jack? They should have got Pembroke comfortably to bed by now. The man will be about again in a month, ready to quarrel with his best friend. What made you meddle in the game? A little mockery might do Nan Purcell's girl some good." John Gore was unfastening the curbs of his black coat. His father watched him, his brows knitted into a sudden frown of uneasiness, the frown of a man surprised by a spasm of pain at the heart. "You all seem so ready to make a fool of the child." "Tut, tut, sir, you ought to have come by more shrewd sense than to make a pother over such a piece of fun. Where the devil, may I ask, did you get that cloak?" John Gore glanced down at the garment, as though my lord's tone of contempt might have made the thing shrivel on his shoulders. "The cloak? You should know it, since it came out of your own wardrobe." "Mine? I deny the imputation." He laughed with a cynical twist of the mouth, and regarded his son slyly over the rim of his wine-glass. "Well, it came out of your room, sir." "Come, come, Jack." "My boy Sparkin fished it out of a chest when he was advising me on frills and fashions. The sobriety of the garment suited my inclinations." Stephen Gore's eyes gleamed for the moment with a flash of fierce impatience. "The meddlesome ape! You must pardon me being tickled by the irony of facts. Since Captain Jack Gore listens to a cook boy's opinions on costumes, I am mum." The son seemed amused and piqued in turn by his father's inquisitive and fanatical prejudices. He swung the cloak from his shoulders and held it up with one hand. "What have you to quarrel with, sir? The refinements of fashion are too deep for me. I shall be landed in Newgate for wearing the wrong kind of buckle on my shoes before the week is out." My lord appeared in earnest. "Pshaw! Quarrel with? Why, the thing is about 10 years out of date. Unpardonable! Give it up, Jack. I'll not countenance you in such a pudding-cloth." John Gore broke into a hearty, seafaring laugh. "Sancta Maria, is the offence so flagrant?" "You might as well go to the King's levee with a dirty face, sir." "Don't guffaw. I'm in earnest. Richards has orders to get rid of all the husks." The sea captain fingered the gold tags. "Being a prodigal, I will put up with such husks as these. I suppose I may be preferred before Tom Richards." My lord took the cloak from him casually, as though he had not noticed the gold chains with their knots of pearls. "Hullo! These are worth saving, after all. I'll keep them myself, Jack. Give a thing and take it back again. That's his philosophy of a sort, according to Hobbes." He laughed, pulled out a silver-handled clasp-knife from a pocket, and cut the gold curbs away from the cloth. "For what we have saved let us be thankful. It is not always wise to lend other people either your opinions or your wardrobe, much less your purse." John Gore had picked up the cloak again. "Three, are there? There must have been four once. Look at the tear there in the cloth. Curious, I should not have noticed it before." My lord took the cloak from him and examined it with a careless air, making use of one corner to hide a yawn. "The mark of the beast, Jack. Tom Richards's fingers have been at work here, or I know nothing of human nature. Well, the fellow must have his pickings. If one worries about a small man's petty pilferings, one ought not to have the insolence to be a courtier. We are all sooted by the same chimney. Another glass of wine, Jack? No? Well, let's to bed." They parted with a handshake and a light word or two upon the stairs, words that hid in either case the deeper impulses beneath. In my lord's heart there was something of scorn, something of dismay, and the fierce uneasiness of a man who loves to look only upon the more flattering features of his soul. There seemed nothing in the incident to shake his confidence, and yet it had shaken him as a light wind sways a mighty elm that is rotten at the roots. A cloak, so much mere cloth, which he had hidden away and forgotten. Yet the thing had brought back visions of an autumn night, of betrayal and of anger, of passionate reproaches and of swift violence in the dark. What though he solaced himself with the oath that death had judged between the fortunes of two swords? The sin of treachery had been his, the blood-guilt remained, and no sophistry and no well-wishing to himself could wipe the stain away. For the son, the happenings of the night had a richer aftermath. He was no self-conscious strutting righter of wrongs, no chivalrous adventure-hunter launching his lance at the world's throat. My Lord Pembroke might have kissed most women with impunity as far as John Gore was concerned, for though they might have protested, he knew, as a man of the world, that not 1 in 20 would have been worth the interference. Any chivalrous fool who had pushed in to a rescue would have merely flattered a coquette with the offer of blood where the other man had only offered kisses. But that tall girl with the Spanish face had given the scene a different meaning. The uncompromising sincerity of her pride had turned a piece of fantastic fooling into insolence and dishonour. The call of solitary soul to soul is ever something of a riddle, and yet to the man there must be that one woman whose hair has the darkness of night, whose eyes are mysterious, whose face has an alluring sadness near to pain. Out of one thread of pathos or of passion may be woven that scarlet robe that covers the dim white body of romance. A trick of the voice, a poise of the head, and the sleeper wakes in the world of colour and desire. The streaking of the night sky by a falling star is not more swift and strange than that flash of divine wonder across the consciousness of a woman or a man. The memory of her standing by the window, tall, defiant, aloof, with those cynical fools mocking her, burned with great vividness in John Gore's brain. He remembered the moment when her eyes had wandered round the room to remain fixed on his. He thrilled still, strong man that he was, at that appeal the girl had given him, as though some instinct had warned her that his manhood was a nobler thing than to suffer her pride to be humbled before them all. Fighting against wild seas and the primeval perils of strange lands had given John Gore the cool and unflurried courage that is steady rather than impetuous, and yet that one glance from the girl's eyes had drawn an instant and impulsive answer from him, as though all that she held sacred had been trusted to his hands. And then, her history, this morose, brooding grief that my lord had hinted at. The very shadow of sadness that haunted her added a mystery, an alluring strangeness that beckoned the soul. She was not like other women. What more subtle deification? For strong natures are untaken save by strong contrasts and by keen impressions. The song of the nightingale may have no meaning for the falcon, nor could the chattering lutes of court beauties call to a man who had stood where court had stood, gazing from Darien on the ocean limitless toward the burning west. John Gore stood awhile at the open window of his room, as he had often stood at the rail of his quarter-deck on a sudden night. The great silence of the sea seemed once more with him, and the far unutterable splendor of the moon. Then, as by contrast, his thoughts were caught by his father's furious convictions as to the importance of the proper droop of a feather or the color of a coat. Who remembered such things when the storm-wind was shrieking, like the ghosts of the sea's dead, through a great ship's tackle? Yet, after all, it was only the fanaticism of another circle, another world. Your scientific zealot will cut a caper over the discovery of some new bug. It was a mere question of environment, and Father Adam may have strutted vaingloriously in some new-fangled smock of leaves. Not for John Gore alone had it been a night of impressions. They had proved keen, pitiless, and pathetic so far as Barbara Purcell was concerned. She was alone in her room, and at her open window the human counterpart of John Gore. In her lap lay a little strand of gold, while the moonlight touched the bleak pallor of her face, making the night, like her heart, a contrast of mysterious light and shadow. With Barbara her impressions were like elemental fire and ice, vivid, distinct, at war with one another. They stood opposed within her mind, hurting her heart by their very enmity. Gratitude and hatred unable to be reconciled, the harsh notes of revenge and the voices of heaven clashing together in the galleries of the brain. She had seen and she had recognized, yet the gross incongruity of it all made her falter for a meaning. The incidents of the night passed and repassed rhythmically before her. The uprising of his manhood in her service, her mother's strained dismay, the scene at the stairs' head, the glimpse of the 3 gold curbs upon the cloak. Where were the beginnings and the endings in this tangled skein for her? Had she not looked for exaltation at this moment when at last it should come into her life? And now that the truth seemed close to her very heart, she found the near future blurred by a dimness of doubt, of incredulity even, of dread. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Summer freshness after rain, a splendor of wet shimmering fields and woods, gardens full of 100 perfumes, a sky changing from azure to opalescent gold on the horizon, the slow sweep of the river through the dream of a summer day, white swans moving over the water, scattered houses with black beams and plasterwork, or warm red walls lifting their gables amid sleeping trees. Now and again the plash of oars and the sound of voices stealing down some quiet reach. 2 boats with cushions and banners at the stern were moving upstream while the day was still in its April hours. They were nearing Richmond, stately in memories and in trees, and Sheen also, where the last of the Tudors delivered up her queenship unto God. The 2 boats had pulled out from Whitehall stairs that morning, carrying a river party to my Lord Gore's house at Bushy. Discretion, and the voice of some backstairs friend, had hinted that my lord and his son would discover the country preferable to the town until my Lord of Pembroke's recovery should be assured. The king had lately assumed a prejudice against brawls, and my lord had left this chance indiscretion in the hands of Hortense, who was, for the while, the king. Stephen Gore had collected a few especial friends to go by river and spend some days with him at Bushy. His deaf half-sister from Kensington had been appointed state duenna for the week. With my lord were two gentlemen of the same political tendencies as himself. My Lady Purcell, fresh and fragrant as a Provence rose, a certain Sir Peter Marden's wife and daughter, blood relatives of the Gores, and Captain John, his son. Moreover, in the same boat as her mother, with a scarlet cushion under her arm, sat Mistress Barbara, solemn and dark as some Proserpine to whom the breath of the summer day presaged the shadows of a sadder world. Her mother would probably have left her at the house in Pall Mall had not the girl displayed a sudden tractable cheerfulness that had surprised Lady Anne into searching for motives. Nor had the fertile and intuitive brain of woman far to seek. My Lady Purcell drew her own amused conclusions, nor was she sorry to suspect the girl of such reasonable yet uncharacteristic softness. It so happened that Barbara and John Gore were not shipped in the same boat, the son having taken charge of the second and smaller of the two, with a cargo of luggage and servants, to say nothing of Master Sparkin, who had scrambled into the bow, and amused himself alternately by tickling the neck of the nearest waterman with a feather and dabbling his hands in the water over gunwale. John Gore's boat proved the faster of the two, and though she started half a mile behind my lord's, she had drawn up by the time that they had reached Mortlake, much to the satisfaction of Sparkin, who had urged the men on to a race. For a while they pulled stroke and stroke, John Gore laughing and talking to the guests in his father's boat. Stephen Gore was steering, his sister next him on his left, Lady Purcell on his right. And the moment that the two boats had drawn level, Anne Purcell had touched my lord's knee with hers, and glanced meaningly at Barbara, who had been looking back at the flashing oars of John Gore's boat. Her mother had been on the watch for suggestions, and in such matters the most commonplace incidents may appear significant. Yet Barbara had merely been watching Sparkin's drolleries, for one cannot always breathe to the rhythm of tragic verse. "Jack, my boy, when you put to sea with a boatload of baggage, you will find yourself faster than stately dowager-laden ships." My lord's second cousin, my Lady Marden, a fat, happy woman, eternally on the verge of laughter, shook the large green fan that ladies used then in the place of a parasol. "Dowagers, indeed! I am sure we look younger than our daughters." "That is always the case," said one of my lord's friends. "I would venture it that Captain John would rather be in our boat," and she glanced at Barbara as though for confirmation. Anne Purcell's daughter gazed at the far bank over the lady's shoulder. "Even a boatload of aunts and cousins may be duller than a Barbary prison," quoth my lord, with a play upon words that no one understood. "And every weevily biscuit better than none, when you're empty," said Sparkin, who seemed to consider himself perfectly justified in airing his wit. But seeing that the venture drew a sharp and ominous glance from the great gentleman in the other boat, Sparkin became suddenly oblivious to its presence, and returned to tickling the brown neck of the man who pulled the bow oar, an act that stamped him as the meanest of opportunists, seeing that the man could not express himself in the presence of quality. The boats were still moving side by side when Mistress Catherine Gore, the deaf duenna, began asking questions in her shrill, aggressive voice. "Who's that boy, Stephen?" My lord assumed an alarmed look and held up a silencing hand. "My dear Kate," he shouted in her ear, "do not ask embarrassing questions." His sister's face betrayed a sudden gleam of shocked intelligence that made my lord's fooling appear more piquant. Deafness had developed a habit of irritability in her, and she was accustomed to blurt out her opinions in a voice that she probably intended for a whisper. "You don't say so, Stephen. I am astonished that your son should have the effrontery. But these sailors—" The other ladies began to giggle. My lord nudged his sister vigorously with his knee. "Jack brought the boy home from America with him." "Why don't you speak louder, Stephen? What did you say her name was?" But as she discovered that they were trying to hide their laughter behind fans and coat sleeves, Mistress Catherine Gore gave her brother one stare and relapsed into a silence that was not altogether amiable. Nor did John Gore look the complacent son, smiling at his father's waggery. He nodded to his men, who quickened at the oars, making the boat forge ahead of my lord's galley. Barbara's eyes met the sea captain's as he glanced back for a moment to look at something, perhaps at her. She was glad and yet sorry that they were not together, for the secret that she concealed made his nearness a martyrdom and a season of suspense. How could she keep the consciousness of that grim blood-debt before her soul, with the beat of the ripples against the boat and the flash of the sunlight on the water? She felt too close to humanity to be able to look into her own haunted heart. These laughing, chattering women, these mercurial, pleasure-loving men. She could only sit there in a silence as in a trance, and let the shores and the tide of life glide by, until she could wake in the tragic loneliness of solitude and of self. The garden of my Lord Gore's house at Bushy came down to the river with a sweep of perfect sward. There was a stone boat-house with quaint copper dragons on the recessed gable-ends, and a gilded vane shaped like a ship in sail. The steps that led up from the river had statues of fauns and wood-nymphs upon their pillars, and along the bank weeping willows trailed their boughs in the brown water of the shallows. The garden itself had all that quaint formalism, that stately simplicity that was part of the lives of some of the old-world gentry. A great stretch of grass cut into 4 squares by gravel paths, with closely clipped bays and yews set rhythmically along the walks. On the north an ancient yew alley, a gallery of green gloom. On the south a broad flower border, full of roses, pinks, and stocks, and all manner of flowers and herbs. On the west the stone terrace of the house, with orange trees in tubs, ranged behind the balustrade. In the centre of all, where the 4 walks met, a fountain playing, throwing a plume of spray from the bosom of a river-god. John Gore's boat, half a mile ahead of my lord's galley, disembarked first at the steps, so that the servants were able to clear the baggage into the house and help in preparing that most essential of all incidents, dinner. John Gore sent Sparkin off to the kitchen, and passed the time pacing the gravel walks, with the river before him and the air sweet with the perfumes of the herbs. The stateliness of the place, its repose and opulence, had a strong charm for the man after rough years of voyaging and the squalid loneliness of prison. He contrasted it with the weird brilliance and fragmental beauty of the countries of the Crescent. Nothing could seem more rich to him than those splendid lawns, like green samite spread without seam or wrinkle. Even the gilded vane on the boat-house had memories, for he could remember coveting it as a child, and the thing may have suggested the life of those who go down to the sea in ships. John Gore saw in season the flash of my lord's oars, the bluff bow of the galley pushing the ripples aside, the banner floating over the stern. Going to the water-steps, he stood there and waited, hat in hand, the quiet dignity of such a man seeming in keeping with such a scene. With one foot on the gunwale, he gave a hand in turn to my lord's guests, while the rowers held the boat in place by using their oars as poles. The character of the different women might have been guessed by the way each accepted the courtesy of the man upon the steps. Anne Purcell smiled in his face with a full-blown and fragrant vanity. Mrs. Catherine Gore gave him a severe stare. My Lady Marden might have melted his dignity with her good humour. Her daughter faltered with assumed shyness, looking at her feet and not into John Gore's eyes. As for Barbara, she ignored his hand unconcernedly, gazing straight before her with a straight mouth and a passionless face. The gentlemen followed, John Gore leaving them to their own legs. He had turned and climbed the steps close on Barbara's heels, noticing, as a man does, the poise of her head and the proud youth in her figure. A high-born and imperious spirit seemed proper from one who walked between those stiff and stately trees. John Gore would not have wished for a hoyden in such a setting. The party moved up the central walk toward the house, my Lady Marden verbosely pleased with everything that she saw. But there were no peacocks. Surely that sweet terrace should have been a proper place for the birds to show their tails. But perhaps my Lord Gore did not like their voices. My lord replied that he saw so many peacocks at Whitehall that there was nothing singular or distinctive about having such commonplace birds on show. He would send for a barge-load if my Lady Marden would promise to imitate a pea-hen in her dress. Anne Purcell looked tired by the fat woman's excessive and loquacious amiability. She had Mrs. Catherine Gore for a stimulating cup of bitters. Mrs. Kate, whose wood billet of a figure looked fit only for a great wheel farthingale. My lord's two gentlemen friends were walking one on either side of my Lady Marden's daughter, who pretended to be embarrassed, and was not. She had a black patch at the corner of a very suggestive mouth, and a figure that did not promise prudery. For the rest, John Gore and Barbara Purcell were left pacing side by side like two grave and staid strangers walking up the aisle of a church. The party dined in the long salon, whose windows opened upon the terrace with its row of orange trees. My Lady Marden careered in her conversation like a fat mare turned out to grass. My lord alone appeared inclined to keep step with her. After dinner there were wines and fruit, wines of Spain and Burgundy, peaches, nectarines, apricots, and grapes. After the fruit and wine, those who desired could steal a siesta, for the river air is fresh after rain, and mature appetites minister at the altar of Morpheus. The two gentlemen were amusing themselves by making hot love to the younger Marden, and watching the expression of keen curiosity and chagrin on Mrs. Catherine Gore's face. To be able to see so many suggestive things, and to hear nothing! What more tantalizing position for a duenna and a spinster? John Gore could not keep back a smile as he watched the drama. He rose and went and stood by Barbara's chair with the quiet simplicity of a man who was not self-conscious. "Do you remember the old place? I suppose you have been here often since I was last here." "No, not for a long while." "Would you like to see the garden?" She glanced up at him and rose. "Yes." And that was all they said to each other for fully 3 minutes. Probably their interest in glass houses, herb beds, and flowers was a wholly subordinate affair, yet it served the purpose of bringing two people together who desired to be near each other for very different reasons. John Gore may have thought the girl curiously reserved and silent, yet he did not wish her otherwise, preferring her swarthy, pale-skinned aloofness to red-faced and commonplace good temper. Men who have seen the world have little use of people who let their insignificant souls bolt from their mouths like a mouse out of a hole. Hearts easily won are easily lost. The open field has no lure for the imagination. High walls and a mass of dusky trees pretend to hide all manner of mystery. Neither of them referred to the brawl of the other night. Barbara, for reasons known to her own heart; John Gore, from a sense of delicacy and chivalrous understanding. He began to talk to her of the days when they had been mere children, and the subject served to sweep away some of the reserve that chilled the air between them. They were in the fruit garden, with its high red brick walls, when John Gore recalled to her an incident of their irresponsible youth. "Do you remember old Jock, the head gardener?" She looked at him with a slight frown of thought. "Jock, the Scotchman?" "The old fellow with the bandy legs, and the head that lolled to and fro when he walked. It was just here that I played that trick on him. You were standing there by the door. I was behind a bush with the squirt. I can see you laughing now, and the flick of your green skirt as you bolted into the yew alley." She smiled, but her face grew grave again abruptly, as though reproved by some power within. "How long ago it seems! We have changed so much. And you have been nearly over the whole world." He glanced at her as she spoke, finding by instinct in her a sense of something to be overcome. It might be the natural strength of reserve in her. Yet she appeared to him like a girl brought up in some fanatical home where laughter was a sign of carnal inclinations. Her heart might begin to smile, but some habit of self-repression stifled the impulse before it could mature. "You will tell me about your voyages?" "If they are of any interest to you." Her eyes met his, and then swerved away with a flash of wayward feeling that puzzled him. "I should like to hear everything. It has an interest for me. And then, you were in a Moorish prison?" He looked into the distance with the air of a man ready to speak of his very self. Prison, that is an experience that grinds the folly out of the heart. A man is walled up with the strange riddle of a thing, himself. It made me learn to understand those old hermits in the deserts. For the devils who tempted them, and whom they fought and cast out into the night, were the devils a man carried about with him in his own heart. Prison makes a man a wild beast, or a philosopher. "More often a beast, Jack," said my lord, who appeared at the gate leading into the yew walk, fanning himself with a big fan that he had borrowed from Anne Purcell. Chapter 13 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 13. On the evening of the third day at my Lord Gore's house at Bushy, Barbara walked alone in the yew alley on the north of the great garden. It was like some dim cloister built for those who fled from the fever of life, to cool their hearts in Gothic mysteries. The dark trunks broke, sheaf by sheaf, into groins that crossed in 1,000 arches. Its shadowy atmosphere seemed silent and remote, full of an absorbed sadness that spoke of sanctuary. On the tennis court beyond the house Stephen Gore and his friends were playing out a match that had been put up for a wager. The women folk were looking on, ready to hazard a brooch or a scarf on the fortunes of a racquet. Barbara, whose heart was full of a fierce unrest, had slipped away alone into the garden, and even if her mother had missed her, she had pinned a sentimental meaning to her daughter's mood. The sun sank low in the west as Barbara walked in the alley of yews, so low that the western arch of the cloister was a panel of ruddy gold. The long shafts of the decline came streaming through and through the criss-cross boughs, splashing the trunks with amber, and weaving a chequer of light and shadow upon the path. There was no sound to break the silence, save the occasional plash of oars upon the river and the faint voices from the tennis court beyond the house. Yet for Barbara the sweet sanctity of the ancient trees had no solace and no shade. She had fled there as to a sanctuary to escape from that most fierce and incomprehensible thing, herself. The desire to be alone had been like the thirst of one in a desert, thirst for quiet waters and the shadow of some great rock. The girl had come to my Lord Gore's house with the purpose of 3 years struggling to be matured. Perhaps she was a little mad, even as a mind that has brooded upon one shadowy memory must lose the same breadth of noonday for the more vivid contrasts of dawn or twilight. The fanatical Spanish blood in her had taken fire and burned those 3 years in the deeps of her sombre eyes. For she had loved the man, her father, as she had loved no other living thing on earth. The manner of his death still woke a slow, ominous fury in her, a phase that placid natures might have been unable to understand. Yet the Jews of old were true and elemental in their vengeances and in the vengeance of their God. They understood that flame of fire in the heart that consumes even its own substance till the sacrificial victim has been found. Yet here was the bitterness of the thing, that she should falter before this very sacrifice. It is so easy to strike when the whole heart is in the blow, so difficult when some trick of lovableness makes the courage waver. If only the man had helped her by being gross, arrogant, or contemptible. Yet he was all that she would not have him be, and all that she, as a woman, would have desired had there been no inevitable tragedy urging her on. His very surface, though she rallied herself with cynical distrust, made her incredulous, even afraid. Often she would fling the very suspicion from her with passionate unbelief, and yet in an hour it would flow back again like dark water into a well. Walking the yew walk in some such mood of doubt and hesitation, she saw a boy's face looking down at her from overhead, a brown, impudent, snub-nosed face with an intelligent twinkle in the eyes. It was John Gore's boy, Sparkin, straddling the fork of a yew, the dense vault of foliage overhead casting a deep shadow that he might have escaped notice like his Majesty in the oak after Worcester fight. Barbara paused and glanced up at him threateningly, angry at the thought that she had been spied upon. "What are you doing there?" "Bird's nesting," said the boy, promptly. "You won't find any eggs this month of the year." "Oh, shan't I?" "No, the birds are fledged." "Some of them sit twice," quoth Sparkin, determined neither to be corrected nor to be crushed, though he had been caught at such a disadvantage. There was a stone bench at the western end of the yew alley, and Barbara, leaving Sparkin skied by his own conceit, walked on and sat down on the bench, knowing that the best way to hurt a boy is to ignore him. But Sparkin was out on no vainglorious adventure. He had nearly been tempted to interest himself in his master's affairs, for it was a new experience for the youngster to watch this king of the quarter-deck dipping his flag to a thing in a petticoat. Therefore Sparkin came scuffling down the tree as soon as he discovered that his ambuscade had failed, and, pushing his way between the yews and a high brick wall, disappeared in the direction of the house. Making a bolt for the doorway leading into the tennis court, he ran full tilt into a gentleman as he rounded the corner, and that gentleman being none other than Captain Gore himself, he took Master Sparkin playfully by the ear, concluding that the boy had been in mischief, and that vengeance in some shape or form followed at his heels. "Hello, what are you running for?" Sparkin had no excuse for the moment. It would have been useless to explain that he preferred the more vigorous form of exercise. "I met Mistress Barbara in the yew walk, Captain." His innocence was sublime. What earthly interest could John Gore take in such a coincidence? "I was bird's nesting, and I thought it would be good manners to run away." John Gore maintained his hold on Sparkin's ear, and looked down at him with shrewd amusement. Then he gave him a fillip, and a gesture in the direction of the house, a hint that the boy had the wisdom to accept as final. The stone bench in the yew walk was set forward a little from the trunks of the trees, and John Gore, as he entered the alley, saw the girl's figure outlined against the gold of the western sky. This tunnel of shadows seemed to him to lead toward mystery and desire. The figure at the end thereof remained motionless as a statue in black marble set before the entrance to a shrine. She did not wake to his presence till he was quite near to her, with the sun shining upon his face and upon the new coat of scarlet cloth that he wore. There may have been some symbolism in the very colour of the cloth. The simple richness of it suited his brown skin and the swarthy strength of his clean-shaven face. "Oh, is it you? You were tired of watching grown men playing with a ball?" "Perhaps I had other things to think of." She moved aside and gathered up her dress so that there was ample room for him upon the bench. Yet, though it was done coldly, imperturbably, without a glimmer of a smile, the man whom she had sworn to kill suspected nothing but habitual melancholy. Your boy was here a minute or two ago. Sparkin? I caught him on the run, and gave him a tweak of the ear to last for a week." "The child seems very fond of you." "Perhaps because I have never spared the rope's end when necessary, and perhaps because he has never caught me lying." "How did you come by him?" "A mere chance. He was no man's child, a kind of wild cat that haunted the river side and lived as best it could. It was before I sailed 3 years ago that I saw the youngster outside a Greenwich tavern. He was standing up in his rags to some big, well-conditioned bully of a schoolboy, and thrashing him squarely by sheer pluck." "That is how you became friends?" "I took him to sea with me and grew fond of the youngster in spite of his insolence, which I chastened like a father. And the humour of it was that after pulling him out of a Greenwich gutter, the boy pulled a ship's crew out of a Barbary prison. I have told you that tale before." Barbara watched his face while he was speaking with an intentness that made him feel the nearness of her eyes. "A lucky day for the boy." "And for me. We are more than quits. I am here in England," and he glanced at her as though he had meant more than he had said. Barbara cherished her reserve. "It was in the autumn of 1675 that you sailed?" she said. "No, earlier than that. I remember the year well." "It was in June, not in the autumn. I remember every month of that year because it was the year that my father died." She spoke calmly, yet he was startled by the expression of her face. It shone white in the half gloom of the evening under the yews, the eyes gleaming out from it with a dull fire. "The month was June, I am sure of that." "If you say it was June, it must have been so. You should know." Her wayward strangeness puzzled him. At times he was even tempted to believe that what my Lord Gore had hinted at might some day prove too true. The thought roused in him a shock of rebellion at the heart, and an instinct of strong tenderness that woke a longing to cherish and to protect. "Are you cold here? There is a mist beginning to rise from the river." "They will be wondering what has become of us." "Let them wonder. I will fetch you a cloak." "No, let us go in." She shivered momentarily, and rose from the bench, drawing a little away from him as they walked up the yew alley together. The east was full of a faint crimson splendour. The colder tints had not come as yet. Neither of them appeared to have a word to say, yet the silence was tinged with a vague mystery that seemed to catch the spirit of the dying day. To John Gore it seemed that any memory of that fatal year chilled the girl like the breath of a raw November night. Barbara went to her room with a feeling of infinite loneliness weighing upon her heart, the loneliness of a grey twilight over a grey land. An utter dreariness dulled all feeling in her for the hour. Perfunctorily, almost blindly, she changed her dress, putting on something richer for the wax lights and the music in the state salon. A procession of dim thoughts moved slowly through her brain, their significance hurting her despite her obstinate self-will. It was inevitable that the man should swear that he had sailed from England before the month of her father's death. Had not the voyage itself been a trick to cover the meaning of the past? Neither he nor that other one whom she suspected had betrayed one glimmer of a tragic intimacy. But that, too, was inevitable. A surface hypocrisy that might betray caution, penitence, even a fading of desire. And yet—and yet— She stretched her arms out with a kind of anguish of incredulous helplessness, feeling utterly alone in a world of bitterness and horror. Could he be that man whose sword had left her father dead that autumn night? Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. Is in the public domain. Chapter 14. My Lord of Gore's coach carried Anne Purcell and her daughter back to Westminster, for the gathering at the house at Bushy had dispersed prematurely, owing to sundry regrettable differences of opinion that had arisen between the three elder women. My lord himself travelled cityward with the Purcells, as though discountenancing Mrs. Catherine Gore, who had been spirited by Lady Marden and her daughter away in her coach to Kensington. For the quarrel, such as it was, had originated in Mrs. Kate's deafness and her utter lack of reasonable discretion, since her loud and irritable tongue had not only set the two elder ladies by the ears, but had driven even her stately brother to a tempestuous ruffling of his dignity. The repartee had verged on coarseness, for Mrs. Catherine Gore was the most exasperating person to argue with on the face of God's earth. Her deafness, exaggerated for the occasion, made her impregnable both against weight of metal and sharpness of wit, and she could retaliate in the most violent and acrid fashion, pretending all the time that she had mistaken the rival disputant's meaning. Thus, when my lord had persisted with some heat and an impressive dogmatism that his sister painted her prejudices too vividly, Mrs. Kate had seized the chance of flinging an explosive retort into the midst of the party. If my Lady Purcell had said that my Lady Marden painted her face, it was no business of her brother's to repeat it, and that only fools made mischief wantonly. And it may be imagined that a few such sweet misapplications of the truth had ruined the tranquillity of her brother's house. John Gore and the two gentlemen had ridden over earlier that morning, for the sea captain had business at Deptford that concerned the men who had lain with him in a Barbary prison. Nor were the three in my lord's coach sympathetically arranged. There were three angles to the diagram, and though two of them may have been in geometrical agreement, the third spoiled the symmetry of the whole human proposition. For Barbara had never seemed more moody or distraught. She sat like a figure of fate, with her great eyes looking into the distance, and her face blank and impassive to any sallies from my lord. An atmosphere of dreariness and of apathy seemed to emanate from her, an atmosphere so sluggish and sincere that it blighted the two elders, who would have been buxom enough if they had been alone. The lord and the lady exchanged glances from time to time. They were wise in their generation, nor were they ready to be displeased at the little romance that appeared to be developing under their noses. The girl had an eccentric way of accepting homage, yet they understood her to be a queer piece of morose comeliness. Nor had she the habit of simpering like other women. Stephen Gore smiled, and looked with surreptitious shrewdness at the mother. Pauvre petite. La maladie des femmes. Jean et Jeannette. They laughed and glanced, each of them, out of their respective windows, not noticing the dull gleam in the girl's dark eyes. Meanwhile the Don John of their love prophecies had changed his nag for a fast wherry on the Thames, and had landed at Deptford stairs before my lord's coach had come within sight of the towers of Westminster. Picking his way amid the sea-lumber of the place, he hunted out a tavern known as the Eight Bells, a tavern with great tipsy tables, and little windows like blinking eyes, and rough benches along the wall. Within, a parlour full of tobacco smoke, black beams, and copper–coloured faces that seemed to conjure up all the adventuresomeness of the wild life at sea. It was a corner of the world where men about a winter fire might tell tales of treasure, of sea–fights, and all the coarse, quaint, crudely coloured romance of the Spanish seas. The mere words were magical to a roving spirit. Pieces of eight, culverins, great rivers with strange names, treasure–houses full of ingots of gold, the far islands of the buccaneers. There men should tell tales of wine drunk under tropical moons, of mulatto women in bright garments, of Indian girls, of prize–money and the smell of powder, and the salt sweat of the bustling seas. The whole strong perfume of that adventurous life seemed to permeate the shadows of that low–beamed room. With Jasper of the guns turning his hawk's eye from man to man, and talking of the days when the captain should sail the ship that they had already seen and coveted. Ha! and Jasper's face grew fierce and happy. They would sweep down the channel with sails whiter than Dover cliffs, and all their cannon sparkling like ingots of gold. There would be pikes bristling in the arm-racks around the masts, the hissing of grindstone as the men sharpened their cutlasses, full sail past Tangier, and a look-out in the foretop for any heathen devil that dared show a nose in the open sea. Even a few piratical jests would not come amiss. Jasper had pictured it all to his mates after they had seen and coveted old man Hollis's ship, the Wolf, lying at anchor in mid-stream. Just the girl to carry the captain in her lap. They would wipe out the smell of that Barbary prison and set the brass boys bellowing like bulls of Bashan. They tumbled up from the benches of the 8 Bells when the figure in the red coat showed at the doorway. Jasper, old sea-wolf, with ringed ears and buckram skin, grinned joyfully, proud with the pride of an old Norse pirate. There was a chair by the rough table for John Gore. He sat down there, while the men formed a ring round him, while Jasper, of the guns, said his say. "We have found you a ship, captain, 20 brass cannon and wings like a seagull. All her tackle new as a girl's stockings after Michaelmas." John Gore looked at them all a little sadly, like a man who must speak bad news. He had picked up Jasper's pipe, and was tracing an imaginary pattern on the table. The sailors would have sworn that it was a love-knot had they been able to see inside the captain's head. "Don't tempt me, Jasper, my man. When you go to sea again, it won't be under my flag." Bluntly, yet with a great kindness for them that could not be hid, he blew to the winds all Jasper's visions of judgment. Not for a year at least would he sail on a second voyage. The big man regarded him sorrowfully, as though listening to the news of a Dutch victory. The sailors looked at one another and shifted uneasily from foot to foot. A pipe was tapped softly, even dismally, on the heel of a sea-boot. One worthy could find no other method of expression than that of firing a stream of tobacco juice into a pile of sawdust in a corner. They were like so many dismasted hulks, with the spirit out of them, so many disappointed children. Jasper's enthusiasm broke into the last flare. "Such a little dancing devil, captain, and her guns all like new pins. She ought to carry you and no one else." The man in the red coat still drew patterns on the table. "Look you, my men, don't count on serving under me. I am high and dry for a year or more. You are too tough to rot here in taverns. My business is to see good men of mine afloat in a good ship." "That's like you, captain." "We did not fight the Sparhawk for nothing, did we? You served me well. I mean to serve you. Will you go to sea as picked men in a king's ship?" Jasper looked at his mates, first over one shoulder and then over the other. "That's the next best," he said bluntly. "Well, then, I'll make it my affair. I can't keep my fingers off a gun or a rope for long, sir, that's God's truth. The smell of the tar sticks, lads. Mr. Pepys and the Duke, if necessary, shall be my men. I would rather see fellows of mine in the best ship that carries the king's flag than rolling in some dirty ketch between Dover and Dunkirk." John Gore called for a tankard of ale, and they pledged healths together in the tavern of the 8 Bells. Leaving them a purse of guineas as largesse, he returned to his boat, with Jasper and his mates acting as a kind of state guard to the waterside. "If God won't have a man, the devil will. That's an old proverb, captain, and the king's a better master than old Nick." With some such philosophy, Jasper looked lovingly on John Gore as he stood on the water-steps and took his leave. Far down the stream, the masts of old man Hollis's ship seemed to beckon them unavailingly toward the brightness of Spanish seas. At the Admiralty offices a plump, buxom, bustling gentleman received John Gore with great good-will. Something of a dandy, with protuberant eyes that appeared to have grown weak with straining at everything that was to be seen, Mr. Pepys bundled himself gladly from the multifarious responsibilities of office, and let loose all his heartiness in the service of a friend. It was impossible to be jovial or to enjoy a gossip where so many detestable quills were scratching and scolding over parchment and paper. The dinner-table was the secretary's inspiration. Mrs. Pepys would be infinitely contented at the thought of an old friend dining off the new silver plate. John Gore and the ubiquitous, but yet lovable, busybody departed dinnerward arm in arm. At home the fair Saint Michel appeared triste and a little out of temper. Her husband's hospitality was often inconsistently impulsive. There are moments, even in the best households, when the joints are scraggy and the puddings like country cousins, homely and out of fashion. Mr. Pepys kissed his wife with excellent unction, let fall a hint that he had seen a new gown at the New Exchange, and compelled the domestic sun to shine by the sheer vitality of his good humour. Jack Gore praised his sherry, and frankly confessed that he had a favour to ask. Mr. Pepys chuckled. So many people always appeared to be in like case. His sherry was the finest sherry in the 3 kingdoms on such occasions. Some of these suppliants—well, that was a purely private affair, and he gave a confidential and deliberate wink that suggested that he was popular. "Most revered Jack," quoth he, "you throw a request in a man's face like a 20-pound shot into a Dutchman's hull. There is just the polite spark at the touch-hole to give one warning, your urbanity concerning the sherry. None the less, I like it. Candour makes me feel quite fat. You will get these fellows of mine well berthed? All captains and lieutenants in 3 weeks. I would have you come and see some of the scrofulous schemers who wriggle in and smirk at me most days of the month. They are so polite, so considerate in suggesting how I may be made a fool and a rogue. And sea captains, sir, seem to be the fated husbands of pretty wives. It makes a Prometheus of me at times, I assure you. And as for Mrs. Pepys here, somehow she always has a sneaking preference for the mild and simple bachelors." The secretary's wife stared hard at her husband's embroidered vest. The direction of such a glance is considered disconcerting when applied to gentlemen who are approaching maturity. "Sam is always a fool where women are concerned," she said, with an autocratic poise of the head. "There now, sir, and I married her. How can she speak such truths? Some more pie. Nonsense apart, Jack, I will see these men of yours well placed." What with chattering on his own affairs and questioning John Gore on his voyage, Mr. Pepys appeared to forget that there was such an incubus as his Majesty's business. He suggested a drive in the park. His own coach, so he said, had eclipsed the Mancini's, as Hortense had eclipsed the Breton Rose. Then there was Nell to be seen in a new play at the King's, but he would not wink at her. Mrs. Pepys should see to that. And their best bedroom stood empty. A man who had so much cosmopolitan gossip to impart could not be suffered to call a link-boy that night. They could sit out together on the leads after supper, and talk till the stars blinked and they both fell a-yawning. The end of all this amiable bustle was that John Gore slept between Mr. Pepys's best sheets, and spent a great part of the following day with him, looking at his books and plate, drinking his wine, and hearing his new maid sing one of the secretary's old songs. For Mr. Pepys was such a bubble of mirth, such a book of shrewd sense, such a register of anecdotes, that his loquacity and his infinite good fellowship made even romance linger in its onrush for an hour. Late shadows were floating down the river before John Gore escaped from the secretary's weak eyes and stalwart tongue. He had some small affairs of his own to attend to in the City and at the New Exchange in the Strand. Some new harness at a saddler's, stockings and shirts at a silk mercer's, a case of long pistols at a gunsmith's in a street near the New Exchange. The pistol stocks were inlaid with ivory and mother of pearl, and he had left them with the smith for an hour to have his name scrolled upon the barrels. A coffee-house and a gazette filled up his leisure, and not being a man afraid of carrying a parcel through the public streets, he returned to the gunsmith's shop and went westward with the pistols under his arm. He took some of the quieter ways past Charing Cross, where the city and the fields met, in scattered gardens and narrow lanes. Apple boughs, already hung with fruit, drooped alluringly over high brick walls. Here and there came the scent of rosemary and sage, of clove pinks, marjoram, and lavender, and through the bars of some iron gate you might see great sheaves of sweet peas in bloom, or torch lilies stiff and quaint, or rose trees with the flowers falling and turning brown. In one of these narrow lanes, with a high wall upon one side and a thorn hedge upon the other, John Gore met the last soul on earth he expected to meet at such a moment, Barbara Purcell, alone, not even followed by a servant. However dreamily John Gore's thoughts may have lingered amid the stately walks of my lord's house at Bushy, he was surprised to see her before him in the flesh. She was dressed quietly, with a cloak over her shoulders, and the hood turned forward to cover her hair, so that she looked more like a shopkeeper's daughter than a young madam from the atmosphere of St. James's. There was no turning back for either of them in that narrow lane, even if either had desired to escape a meeting. John Gore saw her flush momentarily, with a glitter of something in the eyes wonderfully like anger. How symbolical that hedged-in pathway seemed to her, a pathway where fate could not be eluded, and where death followed her like a shadow. "I never thought to see you here." She looked at him darkly with her sombre eyes that made him think of watchfulness and waiting. "Sometimes I come here and walk in the lanes. They are quiet, and one is not stared at." "You should not walk here, though, when it is getting dusk." "Oh, I am not afraid." The unfeigned earnestness of the man betrayed a depth beyond the shallows of mere words. "Others—may be afraid for you. These paths that seem so sweet and green are often the night tracks of the vermin of the streets." Their eyes met and appeared to exchange a challenge. "I have never been troubled here." "God save the chance that you ever should. We can walk back together, now that we have met." She had no excuse with which to parry his grave frankness. Had life promised another meaning, she might have suffered herself to be touched by the message that his manhood seemed to utter. And to John Gore, walking at her side, the rose trees that had bloomed in the quaint gardens were budding again into crimson flame. The high hedgerows were full of golden light, caught and held in the mysterious shadow net of the dusk. Under his arm were the pistols that he had bought at the gunsmith's shop in the street near the New Exchange. He little thought that Barbara Purcell had been bound for that very place, where steel barrels glistened row by row in the oak racks against the wall. Chance and their meeting had prevented her that day, and her first impulse had been one of anger and impatience. It was not easy to slip away alone and unobserved from the house in Pall Mall. John Gore had marred the first endeavour. She could but pretend tolerance, and hold to that patience that counts upon the morrow. Yet when he was leaving her as the dusk fell, she felt like one nearing the grim and incredible climax of a dream. It hurt and oppressed her to be near him, and yet there was an indefinable mystery in his nearness that made her heart cry out against the inevitable doom of all desire. "Good night." "Good night." She felt that he stood and watched her with those grave eyes of his after she had turned from him along the footway, and the shadow of the coming night seemed more apparent to her soul. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. There are few episodes in a man's life that plunge him into that dim forest world of romance where the woodways are full of whisperings and elfin music, and the gleam of moonlight upon the smooth trunks of mighty trees. In youth romance is a habit, in maturity a mere digression. The boy is naturally an imaginative creature. He dreams dreams of beauty and strangeness, and of women whose lips suck the blood from the heart. The marriage service sobers him. He ceases his excursions into hypothetical raptures, and becomes the steady, workaday busybody, proud of his house, his table, or his garden, paternally patient with poetical youth. Affection takes the place of that inconvenient thing called passion. To romance he is inert, fuddled, unless one illegitimate fire plays havoc with his respectable tranquillity. And yet those moments of passion, when the heart was all flame, incense, and music, and the world a young world gorgeous with dawns and sunsets, those moments of wistful youth come back dearly with a rush of regret that makes grey reality transiently bright with a faint afterglow. What though it be a cheat and an illusion? It is the finest dream that will ever steal through the gates of day. The man may remember it when he figures at his ledger, and may yearn secretly for that rich, sensuous youth, which the cumulative common sense of years has crushed into a faded, foolish fancy. There are few lives without one red gleam from the west, one moment of desire when the wind comes with the cry of a lover through midnight forest ways. To feel again that strange stir of mystery many a man has leaped into what the world calls sin. It is but nature's living voice, the potion of sweet herbs that she presses upon her children, that they may drink and see the sky waving with red banners, and smell the far fragrance of pine woods or wild thyme. For life must beget life, and nature weaves her mystery about the hearts of mortal men, only snatching the magic veil aside when her witchery has worked its will. Now my Lord Gore had passed through many such phases, and was as wise as most men who have studied others and themselves. To remain interested in life, the man of the world must be piqued continually by some new plot. A dish that can be had for the asking has less spice in it than one that boasts delicacies from strange lands. And my lord was amused by his son's possible lunacy, even as a man who had been under the table many a night is amused by watching some grave person make a first experiment in the art of self-intoxication. My Lord Gore and his dear goddess enjoyed the little drama together, being in such sympathy with each other that they could discuss its subtleties and smile over its innocent blindness. There was some singularity in the case in question. The woman was not what the world would call wooable. As for the man, he was no courtier, and not given to fine phrases. They imagined that much bellows work would be needed to make such green wood flare up into flame. My lord and Lady Anne were standing at a window in the main gallery of the house, a window that looked out upon the garden and the music-room. My lord was hiding, almost playfully, behind a curtain, and peering at the mother with inimitable slyness. Anne Purcell stood back a little, so that she could hear without being seen. "They are not very talkative," said my lord. "No." "A couple of sphinxes making love to each other without speaking a word. I have no doubt but that Jack will prove a veritable Petruchio. It will be boot and saddle for him to–morrow, and a canter along the road to York to see how his property doth in those parts. A man must be given opportunities of saying good–bye. It is discreet and amiable of us to stand here chuckling in a draughty gallery." Anne Purcell held up a hand, a sharp gesture for silence. "Hark! Some one is playing the harpsichord." "Not Jack." "No one has touched the thing for months." "That accounts for the discords. Mistress Barbara is picking up the old fascinations that girls learn at school. Phew! Jack must be a gallant liar if he can swear that he enjoys it." "For heaven's sake, be quiet, Stephen. I want to listen." She bent toward the window, holding her hollowed hand to her ear. My Lord Gore pulled down his ruffles and leaned gracefully against the wainscoting. He winced hypersensitively as the harpsichord notes jangled out a tune. Well, madam, if you can make anything out of it—" "Be still. For 5 minutes I will have no tongue." There was an expression of bleak intentness upon Anne Purcell's face. More than once her lips moved. My lord watched her with an air of cynical tolerance. Suddenly she straightened at the hips and swung the lattice to with a clash of impatience. "Tut, tut!" quoth the gentleman, soothingly. "Did you hear what the girl is thumbing out?" "No, on my honour." "That song of Sutcliffe's which the Westminster choir master set to music. Such things must run in the girl's brain." A frown gathered upon my lord's debonair and buxom face. "You are always looking for the snake under the stone, Nan. Why should we worry over such a flick of the memory?" "Why? Why, indeed, except that some shadow seems always to strike across my face. You should understand." He drew a deep breath, and expelled it slowly with a hissing sound between his closed teeth. "If you believe in omens, Nan, we must transfer the sinister side of it to Captain Jack. Pah! What do either of the young fools know? They will help each other to forget every one and everything on earth, save their two sweet selves. That is one of the advantages of the disease. What are parents when a lover appears? He has already roused the girl to some show of spirits, and for that, Nan, you should be thankful." There was, however, something false and forced in the energy of his cynicism, and in the flippant way he tossed the past aside. Yet even when they returned to the salon on the other side of the house, the faint, husky voice of the harpsichord followed them like a voice from another world. Chapter 16 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 16 In the music-room a sudden silence had fallen, like the pause between the two stanzas of a song. Barbara, seated on an oak settle with a cushion of crimson velvet, let her hands rest idly on the keyboard of the harpsichord. Her eyes were raised, as though her thoughts had been carried beyond the four walls of the room by the music her fingers had drawn from the keys. Yet it was not the pose of one who was dreaming, for she was looking into a mirror that hung on the wall above the harpsichord. In that mirror, she had hung it there with her own hands, she could see the greater part of the room reflected with all the minute brilliance of a Dutch interior: the polished floor, the oak table, John Gore's red coat, the brown wainscoting, even the vivid grass beyond the window, and the mass colours of a bed of summer flowers. John Gore was sitting in the window-seat, and she could watch his face in the mirror on the wall. He was bending forward and looking at her with an intentness that betrayed his ignorance that she had him at a disadvantage, in that he saw only the curve of a cheek, while Barbara had everything before her. His elbows were on his knees, his hands knitted together between them, his sword lying on the window-seat, the scarf a knot of brilliant colour like a great red rose. He was a man in whom even a child would have found great strength, and a kind of quiet sternness that mellowed when he smiled. John Gore had come to her to say good–bye, and she knew the meaning of his coming, the meaning that had come kindling in those eyes of his since the duel that wet night in June. It was a mere man's trick to be near her, and to turn a month's absence to the service of the heart. And they were alone together in that room where she had found her father dead, the room that might prove an altar of sacrifice. Barbara's white face seemed near to tragedy as she gazed steadily into the mirror on the wall. Every fibre of her heart had been strung to a tenseness that made each heart-beat hard and perceptible. She had put pity from her with the dry cold eyes of a fatalist and the fierce apathy of one driven onward by force of fate. She had faltered too long, clung too treacherously to an incredulous caution. Life had become a dull misery for her, full of infinite doubt and sudden passionate impulses that carried her to the edge of the unknown. Only to grasp the truth, to tear aside the veil of sentiment, to end the uncertainty of it, even if it should be for ever. Her heart was emptying of the power to hate. She had begun to distrust herself. She had to scourge herself with memories, as a fanatic uses a knotted whip upon the flesh. "Is that the end?" The silence had seemed a silence of hours instead of moments, and she started at the sound of his voice, pressing a hand over her bosom with an involuntary spasm of swift consciousness. She was wearing a loose gown with a mass of lace over the breasts. There was something more tangible hidden there than a memory. "I have no voice to sing. I shall only remind you of a missel thrush." "But the harpsichord?" "The notes are all harsh and the wires rusty." She glanced at the mirror and saw the same intentness in his eyes. "Then you do not play often?" "No." "Why not?" "My mother is no music lover, and my fingers have grown stiff." "Why should that have been?" "I have hardly touched the keyboard since—my father died." She watched him in the mirror, but he did not change his posture or betray anything upon his face. It seemed stern and a little sad, the face of a man with depths beneath the surface of reserve. "I can understand that, in measure." His voice struck a chord in her, as a voice that sings may set a wire vibrating. "It was here, in this room." "Here?" "Yes. It was I who found him. His hands had touched these notes the day before. He had sung the song that I have played to you." Upon the panel of the upturned lid was a picture painted in an oval scroll of flowers, a sensuous scene from a fête galante, with men and women dancing and looking love. The colors and the gestures of each minute figure seemed to burn in upon the girl's brain, as small things will when life hangs upon a look or upon a word. Barbara rose slowly, pushing the settle back, and gazing into the mirror at the man's dark and thoughtful face. "It was some unknown sword that killed him." She had turned, and his eyes met hers. "Nothing was ever discovered." "Nothing?" "That was what seemed so strange." She stood a moment gazing through the window at the flowers in the border, yet trying to penetrate by sheer instinct beyond the man's quiet dignity. John Gore remembered his father's innuendos. It had been a pitiable affair for an innocent girl. It would have been even more pitiable had she been confronted with what my lord had hinted to be the truth. "Does the thrust of a sword hurt? I have often wondered." Her eyes were fixed upon him, as though she had discovered the slightest flicker of uneasiness, a length of silence that suggested premeditation. "Why think of such things?" "One cannot always help one's thoughts. They come like the wind through the window." John Gore leaned his head upon his hand, his fingers tugging at his hair, much like a schoolboy baffled by a pile of figures. Man of action, and of the world that he was, his ways were often quaintly boyish. "There may be one pang, perhaps." "The thought of steel in one's body makes one shiver." She seemed to persist in her morbid melancholy like one whose thoughts move in a circle. "Is that the sword with which you fought Lord Pembroke?" "That, yes." "Let me look at it. Strange that such bodkin can be so deadly." He took it for a whim of hers and humoured her, hiding the pity in his eyes. "Why, it is not much heavier than a gentleman's cane." She held it in her two hands, balancing it, and looking at the silver work upon the sheath. John Gore watched her, grave–eyed and compassionate. "It is said that the sword suits itself to the age." "Oh!" And she drew back innocently, step by step. "Broad and trenchant, slim and subtle." "Then you would call this a sword for a treacherous hand?" "No, rather a tool for the man with a brain. Any fool can fight with a club." She drew the blade sharply from the scabbard, still moving backwards step by step till the table was between her and John Gore. "It was some such sword as this that killed my father." "Perhaps." He shirked the subject as though afraid of paining her or abetting her in her distemper. If I could only know the truth. The mystery of it haunts me." She laid the sword upon the table, quite close to her hand, so that she could snatch at it if things came to such a pass. "Some parts of life are better forgotten." "If we can forget." A great impulse stirred in him, bidding him to go to her and take her hands. "The bitter things remain, and with them, for contrast, the silliest trifles." He looked up at her with a brightening of the eyes. "Yes. Heaven alone knows. I can remember kissing my mother when she lay dead, and with the same vividness I can remember a wooden horse I had as a boy, a grey horse, with a brown saddle painted on his back, and his nostrils a gay scarlet. Whenever I see a horse I think of that wooden horse's nose." Barbara gave a queer, short laugh, her face firing with sudden animation. "That is just what life is, and sometimes we see the same thing again, afterward. I can call to mind looking into the window of a goldsmith's shop, and seeing upon a little green board a short gold chain with a knot of pearls for a button. Why I should have noticed and remembered that one thing, I can't tell. But I saw its brother chain one night this summer." His eyes met hers, calm, steady, and unperturbed. "Where?" "On the cloak you wore that night." "A cloak?" "Yes, at Hortense Mancini's, when you came in wet with the rain. And I thought that one of the gold chains seemed missing." She watched his face, her hand going instinctively toward her bosom. "Strange. That chain probably belonged once to the cloak I wore." "Ah." "There was a chain missing and a small scar in the cloth, as though it had been torn away. The loss might easily be answered for." She steadied herself against the table, feeling every muscle in her rigid, yet ready to tremble when the end had come. "You had worn that cloak before?" "I?" He glanced up at her curiously, struck by her white, set face and the harsh straining of her voice. "Yes." "No. The cloak was borrowed, if the truth concerns you." "Borrowed?" "I came home from the sea with one shirt, one coat, and the other part of me in like proportion. My father's wardrobe came to the rescue." "Then the cloak was my Lord Gore's?" "Yes, and his man probably stole the chain and sold it." He laughed, but on looking up at her again a silent, questioning wonder swept the lighter lines aside. She was standing motionless behind the table, her hands fixed upon the edge thereof, her eyes staring at nothing, like the eyes of one in a trance. Yet even as he looked at her a great spasm of emotion seemed to sweep across her face. She turned without a word to him and fled out of the room. John Gore found himself looking at the table behind which she had stood and at the sword that lay unsheathed thereon. The inexplicable swiftness of her mood went utterly beyond him, save that the words my lord had spoken flashed up like letters of fire upon the wall. He rose and went to the door of the music-room, moving slowly as one weighted with thoughts that bear heavily upon the heart. The garden was empty, save for its closely clipped bays. Like some wayward cloud-shadow, she had passed it and was gone. But Barbara had fled to her room with a tumult of deep feeling within her heart. It was as though something had broken within her brain, letting forth infinite tenderness that welled up into poignant tears. She went in and fell on her knees beside her bed. And if her heart found utterance, it was in the one short cry, "Thank God!" End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. John Gore rode for Yorkshire the next day, mounted on a good grey nag, with pistols in his holsters, and a servant with a blunderbuss and a valise strapped on the saddle of a stout brown cob. Travellers had to take their chance of meeting rough gentry on the road, and many a nervous countryman, weighing 16 stone, made out his will before he did so desperate a thing as travel 40 miles. The sea captain was not a man with jumpy nerves, and his thoughts went to and fro between rentals and harvestings and the ways of women, as though he sat smoking at home in a padded chair. Put a man in the saddle on a summer morning, when the dawn is coming up, and all the hedgerows are dashed with dew, and he will be moved to sing, and to think well of the world, for the fresh kisses of the dawn leave no stain upon the mouth. John Gore was thinking of Barbara Purcell, and the mistake a man so often makes is to accuse a woman of whims when he does not understand her, it being easier to call a thing by a name than to investigate its properties. Man is the creature of a superstition in this respect, and if a cow kicks the milk pail over, he calls her a cussed beast, and as such she is branded. For man, taking himself so solemnly, cannot stay in his stride to find out why a woman has her silks or her worsteds in a tangle. If she weeps, his great solatium is a sweep of the arm and a kiss. If she seems sulky, it is just her perversity, and it is no more use for him to trouble his wise head about her vapours than to ask a February morning cloud why it shows such a sour face. It is nature's business, and man, unless he happens to be a psychologist, leaves it as such and thinks about his dinner. John Gore, jogging along at a good pace, with the fields and woods all silver under the rising sun, looked back at the hours of yesterday with more thoroughness than the majority of lovers. An ordinary egotist might have drawn some flattering inference from the strange melting of the girl's reserve, and her eagerness to escape him. He would have reminded his own conceit that a woman cries "Shame, sir," and thinks what she will wear for the wedding. But John Gore was not so ordinary a fool. His thoughts went deeper into the soil than the thoughts of frailer men, and he had more true manhood in him than to insinuate even to his own heart that because a woman played the will-o'-the-wisp she was luring him on with the lure of mystery. It was all so simple, had he but known, as all great secrets seem when they are once discovered. Your astrologist goes weaving grotesque obscurities about man's destiny and the stars, till one calm brain sets the whole grand and reasonable scheme in order. Men wrote with prodigious pomposity about a pump. Nature abhors a vacuum, quoth they, and nature, like a misunderstood woman, laughed in her sleeve, knowing that the larger a wise man's words are, the less he knows. That Lionel Purcell's death had left a great void in the girl's life, and that she still brooded over the violent mystery of it, of these things John Gore felt assured. He could put no clear meaning to the mood of yesterday, save that much grieving had left, as it were, an open wound upon the brain, and that memory, touching it, would not suffer it to heal. She had never given him one glimpse of the real purpose that she cherished. Yet probably John Gore's nag would have leaped forward under a sudden slash of his rider's spurs had the man been told what Barbara had kept hidden from him in her bosom. As it was, her past life appeared to him suffused with a wistful glow of infinite sadness, infinite regret. Her face rose before him dim with a mist of autumn melancholy. Her crown was a crown of scarlet berries, woven and interwoven amid the dark peril of her hair. As for Barbara, she had fallen into a strange mood that day when John Gore rode northward out of her life. She rose early and walked alone in the garden, showing an untroubled face to her mother when my lady descended after taking breakfast in bed. Barbara, to appear occupied, had a basket on her arm, and a pair of scissors with which she was cutting off the dead flowers along the border. Anne Purcell was a lady who had never bent her back over such a hobby. Such things were for maiden ladies with round shoulders and no bosoms. And the mother was a little inquisitive that morning, for John Gore's face had told her nothing the night before. Her wishes were all for an understanding between the two, and she was not squeamish. The grip of a man's arm would hug the mopes out of the girl. Barbara needed hot blood to teach her to live and to enjoy. My lady was wise in all these matters. "It is a new thing for you to touch the harpsichord, Barbe," she said. with that kindness that comes easily when people seem inclined to shape themselves to one's wishes. "I will send Rogers to the city, and have a man out to tune the wires." Barbara reached for a dead flower, showing off her figure finely as she leaned over the border, but there was no man there to see. "You can have a singing master again, if you wish it, so that you can sing to some one when he comes riding back from the north." She laughed and looked at her daughter with motherly archness. It was good, at least, to see the girl busying herself even over such things as dead flowers. "My voice is not worth training." "What! When some one is ready to sit in the dusk and hear you sing?" Barbara looked at her mother innocently enough. She was all meek guile that morning. "My Lord Gore is a good judge." "Why, to be sure, he shall give you a lesson or two. We must get you some new songs pricked. The old ones are too chirrupy and out of date." Thus my lady imagined that she had discovered much of the truth, and perhaps she had discovered some small portion of it beneath that placid surface. Dead flowers! Anne Purcell had no prophetic instinct in such matters, and Barbara was glad when she was gone, and the garden empty of all thought save the thought of expiation. She was neither happy nor sad, but possessed by a strange tranquillity, like the first sense of coming sleep to one who has been in pain. She might have been surprised at her own calmness, had she been in a mood to be surprised at anything. It was as though bitterness and doubt had been swept out of her path, leaving the way easy toward the inevitable end. Barbara went into the music-room, and, lifting the lid of the harpsichord, let her fingers go idly to and fro over the notes. So few hours had passed, and yet the passionate voice of yesterday had died down to a distant whisper. She was glad, quietly glad now, that he had gone out of her life innocent and unharmed. There was still the blood debt between them, and in the consummation of her purpose she would leave him a memory that could retain but little tenderness. It was a strange yet very natural mood, the mood of one going calmly to the scaffold with all the fears and yearnings of yesterday drugged into stoical sleep. Her one wonder was that she had been so blind, and that she should have overlooked the grim simplicity of the riddle of 3 years. Now everything seemed as apparent and real to her as the reflection of her own face in the mirror upon the wall. Her whole insight had seized upon the discovery and accepted it with swift conviction, even as a man in doubt seizes on the text that answers his appeal. She could have laughed at her own blindness, had laughter been possible over such a hazard. My Lord Gore was to sup with them at 6 o'clock that evening. Barbara looked calmly toward the hour, as though her heart had emptied itself of all emotion. There was no anger in her, no haste, no clash of horror and regret. "I shall kill him to-night," she said to herself, quite quietly, as though there could be no other ending to that 3 years' vigil. Judged by the ordinary sentiment of life, men would have called her utterly callous, execrably vindictive, a thing without any heart in her to feel or fear. Yet fireside judgments are shallow things. No man knows what a hanging is like till he happens to drive in the tumbrel to Tyburn, and the imagination looks for lurid lights where everything may be as calm and cold as snow. It is easy for a man to sit as judge with the stem of a pipe between his teeth, and a good dinner inside him. He has no more knowledge of what love and desire and vengeance and death may be than a plum-pudding can know the thoughts inside the head of the woman who stirred it in the making. At noon Barbara dined with her mother, and in a Venetian vase upon the table there were some late roses sent from my Lord Gore's garden at Bushy. The subtle scent of the flowers remained with the memory of that day, like the perfume from censers before a sacrifice. After dinner she dressed herself, and, taking the girl who waited on her as maid, walked in the park and down past Whitehall toward the river. The girl with her noticed nothing strange, save that she was very silent, and seemed not to see the people who went by. Leaning over the parapet of the river-walk, Barbara saw a barge moored near in, and a couple of brown children sitting at the top of the cabin steps and blowing bubbles from broken clay pipes. The soapy water in the porringer between them would not have been wasted had it been used upon their faces, but they were so brown and healthy and happy watching the bubbles sail and burst that Barbara turned away from the waterside with the first pang of the heart that she had felt that day. Coming back past Whitehall, a troop of the King's Guard came by with drums beating and trumpets blowing, and all the pomp of the palace in their red coats and burnished steel. The girl with Barbara stopped to stare, but Barbara walked on under Hans Holbein's gate, letting a crowd of boys rush past her to see the red coats and hear the trumpets. She would have liked to have wandered into the fields beyond Charing village, but time was passing, and there were things to be remembered. She went straight to her room on reaching home, and locking the door, opened an oak coffer, of which she kept the key. Lying there on a green silk scarf were two pretty little flintlocks, their barrels damascened and the stocks set with silver. She took them out, and, sitting on her bed, held them in her lap while she ran the ramrod down the barrels to see that the charges were safely there. The scattering of powder in the pan from the ivory powder flask should be left till the last moment. Barbara was putting the pistols back in the coffer when she heard voices at the far end of the gallery. It was her mother and Mrs. Jael talking together. Their footsteps came down the gallery, and a hand knocked at the door. "Yes, who is it?" Mrs. Jael's voice answered, bland and sweet. "Mistress Barbara, my dear. My lady wishes to see you in her room." Barbara closed the lid of the coffer, put the keys in her bosom, and went to the door. Mrs. Jael curtsied, never forgetting her good manners. "Will you please go to my lady's room?" "What does my mother want with me?" "Go and see, my dear mistress," quoth the woman, with an air of motherliness and mystery. Barbara passed up the gallery without locking the door after her, since Mrs. Jael made a pretence of going down the stairs. Yet the woman was back again, with a briskness that did her years credit, so soon as she had heard the closing of my lady's door. Mrs. Jael appeared wise as to what to do in Barbara's room, probably because of that peep-hole in the wainscoting of the wall. She went straight to the table where the oak coffer stood, pulled out a bunch of keys from her pocket, and, choosing one marked with a tag of red ribbon, unlocked the coffer and lifted the lid. Mrs. Jael showed no surprise at seeing the pistols lying therein, half concealed by the green scarf. She ran a knitting needle, which she drew from her stocking, down each barrel in turn, holding the pistol close to her ear and listening as she probed it. Then she examined the powder pans, smiled to herself sweetly, and, putting the pistols back just as she had found them, relocked the coffer and sidled out of the room. Chapter 18